walloping web snappers. It's another amazing, spectacular, ultimate, superior episode of the mediocre Spider-Man. What happened? The show that lifts up the troubled stories of video games and movies with all the proportional strength of a purple-suited skeleton man. I'll never be as cool as Spider-Man. Anyway, speaking of never being cool, Spider-Man 3! With arachnid-based radioactivity sweeping the world this week, it's as good as time as any to take a step back into the long-forgotten age of the mid-2000s, where the adventures of the cinematic superhero were gearing up with such blockbusters as Catwoman, Fantastic Four, and on top of them all, Sky High. Oh god, we have it so good nowadays. Back then, the crown jewel of the genre was of course director Sam Raimi's Spider-Man films, which adapted the exploits of noted turbo nerd Peter Parker and his superhero secret identity. Stan Lee and Steve Ditko's creation proved to be box office gold, and with the massive success of the first two movies, Raimi and Sony Pictures were swinging into high as they launched into pre-production on a third film almost immediately after the last. 3 years later, the film was set to debut in Cineplexes in May of 2007, where, Matt sense.
This is something else.
Brief recap. 2004's Spider-Man 2 went well, very well in fact, as it was the second biggest box office success of that year, right behind the turgid girth of the mighty Shrek 2. So everyone knew that a follow-up would have the potential to be even bigger, but both Raimi and Sony had different ideas on how to do that. If you've seen Spider-Man 1 or 2, you'll know that Raimi is a huge fan of the character's adventures throughout the 60s and early 70s, because by the 80s he was making up his own stories by drenching Bruce Campbell in green slime. When Raimi began thinking up potential stories for a third film, his first instinct was to introduce Sandman as the main villain, with Harry Osborn's storyline remaining more or less the side plot. So combining those two antagonistic forces with Mary Jane and Peter's relationship was going to be the main thrust of the film. This was the original story pitch for Spider-Man 3. However, man, I say that a lot, there was pressure from Sony Pictures to raise the stakes, as they wanted to see additional villains for Spidey to fight because that type of shit sells more toys.
Wanna put some dirt in your eye?
Raimi acquiesced to this and felt he could find room to squeeze in the Vulture, another golden oldie, into the story he was already pondering. This phase of pre-production actually got far enough that Raimi was looking to cast Sir Ben Kingsley, best known for his role in the cinematic classic Blood Rain, as Adrian Toomes. Now, while this technically should have satiated the demand to raise the stakes, it wasn't exactly what Sony Pictures and especially infamous mega-producer Avi Arad had in mind. Avi has had a long but limited career, with the bulk of it producing the early 2000s superhero schlock I made fun of earlier in this very script. Out of the dozens of films and their posters he has had his name slapped on, Spider-Man was probably the one he was most proud of, but ironically it was with his interjection that caused the series to end with a wet, shameful spider fart.
See ya, chump. What the hell?
He took Raimi aside and explained that he should really consider dropping Vulture to include more characters that younger fans of the old webhead had grown up with. And Avi was concerned that Raimi was simply picking the villains he personally liked and wasn't taking into account the rest of the fanbase. Now, any guesses as to which villain Sony and Arad wanted? Was it A. Cardiac, B. Kane, C. Venom, or D. It was Venom. They wanted Venom. Now, while they were suggesting this as some sort of benevolent gesture to Spidey fans the world over, Sony had a secret back pocket plan that even Raimi was unbeknownst to. While initially a villain, Venom evolved throughout the 90s and became the Lethal Protector, an anti-hero that had no qualms killing the bad guys, whether they be security guards, other symbiotes, or schlubs wearing big dumb metal suits. Sony was acutely aware of Venom's popularity and wanted to spin him off into his own series of films all the way back then, and felt that by introducing him into what was going to be, at that time, the biggest, most expensive superhero movie ever was a surefire way to do it. Raimi resisted, explaining that Venom was a character from well after his time, and felt that Eddie Brock lacked humanity and wasn't really interested in bringing him onto the silver screen.
When are you gonna give a guy a break?
Now, I'm not sure what reading material Raimi was provided with or perused himself to get up to speed on the character, but if it was the really early 90s stuff, I can't really blame him for feeling that way. Venom was pretty one-dimensional at that time, he just looked super cool, but he was a loner that simply wanted to kill Spider-Man for a perceived slight, and whose personality was quite alien-like. Raimi did a fantastic job humanizing a mad scientist with metal tentacles fused to his spinal cord, but simply felt he couldn't do the same with Eddie Brock. Avi persisted, however, hammering home the fact that there were whole other generations of Spidey fans who had waited decades to see the character in a motion picture. And he reminded Sam that he had already gotten to include his other Golden Age favorites like Goblin, Science Squid, and was still getting a crack at Sandman. After enough pressure, Raimi eventually relented, as this became a sort of make or break part of the deal. If he didn't want to be replaced, he was going to have to inject some. This move, unfortunately, doomed the entire movie from a variety of standpoints, with the main one being Venom's complicated origins that couldn't just be explained away by going, "Here's Venom!" You can't have Peter running off into the Secret Wars or bring in Jonah's son again and do a moon landing thing, then you gotta do Man-Wolf. I'm getting off track here. Point being, introducing the black suit was always going to dominate the script, at the expense of pretty much everything else. The scriptwriter for Spider-Man 3, Alvin Sargent, who also did Spider-Man 2, found himself overwhelmed with everything he had to shoehorn in there. The black suit, Goblin, Sandman, Peter, Mary Jane, Ursula and the cookies. There was just so much stuff that by the end, there wasn't a whole lot of room for Eddie/Venom, ironically enough.
If you know what I'm talking about.
Oh, let's not forget Gwen Stacy. She's in there. I don't know why. She doesn't really have anything to do with this story being told per se, as Mary Jane kind of stole the scene she was famous for. Now, apparently, in an earlier draft that Raimi was toying with, there was going to be an other girl that he wanted to include in more of a minor role. Sony producers then stepped in and had that character changed to be Gwen, which simultaneously beefed up her screen time because that would make the movie better somehow.
Of course!
The script was ballooning in size and complexity with every draft, so much so that Alvin Sargent, for a brief period, began to see whether or not he could separate the script into two, which of course would have led to a two-parter. This might have actually been the better option looking back, but unfortunately, no matter how hard he and even the producers tried, they couldn't find an appropriate point in the storytelling where the film could be split. So it would remain a single overstuffed experience. Once the arduous scriptwriting process was done, the arduous filming of the movie then kicked off. It was a grueling 110 days of continuous shooting, with a release date that absolutely could not budge, May 4th, 2007. Trying to hammer out the script is where a lot of time was lost, as Sam, his brother Ivan, and Alvin Sargent spent almost 2 years trying to do so. In terms of on-set problems, Bryce Dallas Howard was unknowingly pregnant while having to shoot stomach-churning stunt sequences suspended from a harness to get in all of her action scenes. Sam Raimi himself was working incredibly long hours, having to sometimes dash between 7 different sets all on the same day to get everything on a shot list to keep on schedule. Thomas Hayden Church, who played Sandman, recalled they really should have cloned Sam back when the first Spider-Man was making 400-something million. They should have had 6 Sams direct this movie. The dentures that Eric Foreman had to wear were ill-fitting and caused him considerable pain whenever he filmed a scene post-symbiosis. Ah, right, Topher Grace. His version of Venom felt, how should I put this, slapped in there at the very last second, and guess what? He felt like a very one-dimensional villain. The dialogue and the way he played Eddie was also not what fans expected, almost as if the movie was being directed by someone who didn't really get Venom's appeal. Many fans didn't care for Grace's performance and felt he wasn't a good match for the character, especially physically.
Yeah, a little chunky.
Which was something that Grace himself agreed with when Raimi had casted him. My first reaction was, this is probably a really bad idea. People are religious about not straying too far from the page. Well, that's just what Raimi wanted to do, since he didn't find Venom's original guise and motivations all that interesting. With Eddie, they were going for more of a similar but different doppelganger-style take on the character, both mentally and physically, rather than the hulking beast seen in the comics. If that was the case though, then Raimi should have just used Spidey's actual doppelganger. I mean, no, wait, that's a terrible idea. What was I thinking? Despite all of this though, the cast and crew did complete the mammoth shoot on time, getting all the footage they needed, which was then passed off to the special effects and CGI teams. Say what you want about the script, the casting, the dialogue, you know, pretty much everything, but Spider-Man 3 knocked it out of the park with the Sandman effects. It's why Raimi chose to include the character in the first place. Visually, he was always going to be impressive. All of the special effects in the world, however, can't save clunky storytelling and underbaked characters. While it certainly retains much of Raimi's flair and sense of fun, it was bogged down with so much stuff that it just failed to be a truly satisfying finale. While lots of mediocre to terrible superhero fare was flying into cinemas around that time, the Spider-Man series was up to that point seen as the cream of the crop, but the very divisive reception to Spidey 3 proved that even the greatest heroes could fail, fall, die trying. But, and this is a very big but, the hype leading up to its release was some monolithic shit, making it the most financially successful entry in the trilogy, which was enough for Sony and Raimi to continue their somewhat strained relationship. Everyone on the inside knew it was an exhausting film to write, shoot, and promote, so many on the creative and business sides weren't 100% sure that the series would even continue. 3 blockbuster tentpole releases in 8 years in a row is a lot for just one director, so there were questions whether Raimi would return, or if the reins of the franchise would be handed off to somebody else or rebooted. Kristen Dunst certainly had an opinion on this back in 2007. It's disrespectful to the whole team, I think, to do that, and audiences aren't stupid. It'd be a big flop without me. It'd be a big flop without me, Toby, or Sam. That would be really not the smartest move, but they know that already. Sony co-chair Amy Pascal would never do that. Oof, slap that one up on poorly aged, if you please. Negotiations between Raimi and Sony began after a long, extended break, with the goal being to hash out a deal for Spider-Man 4, but it just as quickly fell apart. Raimi insisted on Vulture as the main villain this time, with John Malkovich now in the role, but Sony wanted the Lizard, and since neither side wanted to go through this song and dance again, they agreed to disagree. The deal never got off the ground, and these preliminary plans were very publicly cancelled, and since none of the principal actors wanted to return without Raimi's involvement, they didn't. Therefore, mere hours after the news hit that Spidey 4 was a no-go, Sony announced they already had a reboot script in the works by James Vanderbilt. Whoa, isn't that a funny coincidence? It's almost as if they had planned this all along. This reboot then of course became the Amazing Spider-Man film series, which suffered absolutely no problems at all and wasn't a huge clusterfuck in every single way. Now, you'd think after this point, Sony would have treated Spider-Man 3 as some shameful little secret that they would want to wash their hands of, since it was their meddling that ruined it, but never underestimate the greed of capitalism.
Oh, groovy, smashing, yay capitalism!
They put out an editor's cut of the film in 2017, its 10th anniversary, that makes a number of small additions and alternate takes, along with 2 major ones. Flint Marko has a scene where he tries to connect to his daughter by making making a sandcastle, giving his character a bit more weight, as well as Harry's redemption coming from a completely different and more natural source. What this cut isn't, however, is some drastically improved vision of Spider-Man 3 that corrects its most egregious mistakes. A simple marketing stunt by Sony to squeeze more money out of Spider-Man fanboys, yes, I bought it. Now, unlike most directors, Sam Raimi has always been willing to discuss some of his more shaky projects, and despite his best intentions, he admits Spider-Man 3 is one of those projects. It's a movie that just didn't work very well. I tried to make it work, but I didn't really believe in all the characters, so that couldn't be hidden from people who love Spider-Man. If the director doesn't love something, it's wrong of them to make it when so many other people love it. I think raising the stakes after Spider-Man 2 was the thinking going into it, and I think that's what doomed us. I should have just stuck with the characters and the relationships and progressed them to the next step and not tried to top the bar. Unfortunately, he also took the fan backlash from the movie particularly harshly, as it was enough to scare him away from tackling any other superheroes for more than a decade. I didn't know that I could face it again because it was so awful having been the director of Spider-Man 3. The internet was getting revved up and people disliked that movie, and they sure let me know about it, so it was difficult. But then I found out there was an opening for Doctor Strange 2. My agent called me and said, "They're looking for a director at Marvel for this movie and your name came up. Would you be interested?" And I thought, I wonder if I can still do it. They're really demanding those types of pictures, and I felt, well, that's reason enough. I didn't think I would ever be doing another superhero movie. It just happened. Truth be told, over the years, Spider-Man 3 has slowly accrued this so bad it's good style quality. The wild swings in tone, the 7 different storylines, the cheesy dialogue, the campy performances, and the bonkers special effects are all stacked and layered into this sugary shit cake that's not good for you, but you can't help but want to take a bite every so often.
So good.
Now, Sam Raimi loves Spider-Man and considers those films, the first 2 at least, a highlight of his career, so it's always a shame that due to creative differences and internal pressure that it ended so sourly. It just goes to show that even if you launch into a creative project with tons of hype, financial freedom, and experience backing you, that the greatest battle still lies within. If you know of any other mismanaged Marvel misfires, let me know in the comments below, over on my Twitter, or wall crawl up to the Flophouse VIP Patreon and become a big J. Jonah Jameson to nominate the game or movie you want me to cover in our next video. See you next time, and thanks for watching!